Hello, dear beloveds. What a beautiful, well, it's quite a chilly Melbourne evening. We seem to have moved into proper autumn now, although it's Melbourne, so who knows how long that will last for. But I have just been talking about the Sankalpa Mudra in the I'm Spiritually Fierce group, which is a beautiful kind of segue into what we're doing here together today. So this week I really wanted to give, I guess, a little bit of background to what's brought me to this place in my life and in my path of service, and to share with you some, I guess, really some of the key people who have informed my work and what's brought me to this place where I now train women as spiritual leaders and teach women to know themselves as God, and all the kind of people who've had an influence on that. And I'm not going to try and introduce you to all of them because it's a fairly long path that I've been on, but I thought I would go back a little bit further than some of the things that I've shared more recently in I'm Spiritually Fierce, in the Spiritually Fierce book. I've shared a lot of my story in there, but it's more recent history in terms of the influences on my work. And I would love to share with you a little bit more about some of the key people who have really, I guess, given me what I need to have reached this place in my life and on my path of service. And of course, when I look back at it now, I can see how all the dots connect, as we often can do in hindsight. We can see how, all our choices led us to this place, and now it all seems to make sense. But, some of the key figures in me becoming the spiritual teacher and leader that I am haven't been in the spiritual realm at all. Some of them have been people who I would say at the time really let me down, or who I felt like things didn't go as I was expecting. But now I can look back and see in the fullness of time the way things that have worked. And some of them have just been remarkable men and women who have really anchored me into my spirituality. I've talked a lot about my first teacher, Angelique, who's my mother, and I talk a lot about her influence on me in the book, I Am Spiritually Fierce. So I won't focus on her today, although I will do a live about her influences on me, particularly because her spiritual awakening happened in my early childhood. And so when people say to me, when did your kind of spiritual path begin? I don't know a time prior to it being exactly what I am and who I am. So she is absolutely, of course, for so many reasons, but from the perspective of being a spiritual teacher, she is the one who really began me on my path. And I'm very grateful for that, because she has so much integrity in terms of the people that she studied with and the books that she read. She's always been really interested in, I guess, high spiritual philosophy and high spiritual texts, so those classic spiritual texts, and that was my foundation, that was my anchoring, and I feel really grateful for that because I think it set me up beautifully. I guess one of the first choices that I made for myself on the spiritual path, and one of the people whose work is deeply influential to me now as I take women into the spiritual directorship training, is my training in transpersonal counseling. And that began for me very young. I finished high school very young. I finished high school very young. Yes, that's true. I was 16, but I finished university very young as well. And I sort of came out the other side of that. And that was amazing training. I did a theatre degree, thinking that I wanted to be Kate Winslet. And at the time, Titanic had just come out, and I had dyed my hair really bright red like Kate's in the movie. And I have a slightly English accent anyway, and I would often sort of not be mistaken for her, but people would often say, you look really like her. And I really wanted to be an actor and to pursue that path, until I did a few auditions and kind of realized the reality was that people were going to boss me around and tell me, what to do, but give me no creative freedom. And then I realized that was not the path for me. And that's a whole other story. But at the same time, so just after I graduated from university, this spiritual yearning, wanting to keep learning and growing and knowing on my spiritual path, which has not changed, not for one moment, really rose up in me. And I found my way into a transpersonal counselling qualification at Icon Institute in Fremantle in Western Australia, and I lived in Perth at the time. And I was one of the last students of Ralph Locke, who started Icon Institute. And it was really a fascinating thing for me as a young 19 or 20-year-old woman to go into that program with a really diverse range of influences in the group who were doing the path, were walking that path with me. So that was a year-long training, and it included case studies, and it included lots of group assignments, and it, it was a real deep dive into looking at archetypes. And that was the first time that I became really, really obsessed with archetypes. And so understanding archetypes from the work of people like Joseph Campbell, The Dark Night of the Soul, The Hero's Journey, and learning how to turn personal story into universal mythology. And that was a big part of the training, as well as a whole bunch of other things, how to create altered states of consciousness, and how to, do lots and lots of therapeutic intervention that was non-traditional. So transpersonal sort of meaning, above or including all of the personal, of the person, not just that part which normal mainstream psychology tends to work with. And so I loved that year. It was also incredibly difficult because I was by far the youngest. And my youth, I don't think, was the problem. There was a number of women in that group who had just a lot more life experience than me. And I felt like there was a lot of really vulnerable people. In fact, one of the women did end up being hospitalized multiple times in that year because of her mental health crisis. And so I was initiated into things by the other students as much as I was trained by Ralph. And Ralph was a remarkable teacher. He's one of my only male teachers. I've had a few, and he was the first. And that was new energy for me as well, because I'd worked predominantly with my mother and with her friends who were women as well. And so I was being sort of immersed into a very different energy there. But that grounding in transpersonal counselling, I think, was absolutely vital for where I've gone in terms of getting that training and understanding how an institute can work. I think that really seeded my consciousness that from the very beginning, I didn't want to be an individual one-on-one practitioner. I wanted a training institute, and my desire to learn to teach. So my desire to learn is so that I can teach, is very well supported by being part of an institute. And of course, that's exactly what I did when I created the Institute for Intuitive Intelligence. Right from the beginning, I didn't want to just be Rikki Jane Adams. I wanted to create an institute, a learning, and training school. And I think that the work with Ralph very much influenced that, and the work of really understanding how to work with mythology and how to work with transpersonal energies and how to move beyond personal ego identification. I learned things, about ergotropic and trophotropic states of consciousness. I began to understand the way that humans make meaning and the way that our brain or our minds can be directed intentionally, that we can put people into altered states of consciousness so that they don't experience pain, or that they can cultivate sensation in the body. Simple practices like, if I ask you all now to imagine that you're standing at your kitchen bench, and imagine that you're cutting a lemon in half with a very sharp knife, and the juice drips out of the lemon, and you pick up that half of the lemon now and you put it in your mouth and you suck on the juices, and you will start to produce saliva as though you were putting a lemon in your mouth, and beginning to understand how we can use the body as a vehicle of consciousness was a very profound thing to do. I went on after that, interestingly, to study drama therapy. And at the time, this was in the 90s, the late 90s, this was not mainstream at all. And I traveled across to the eastern states by myself to a little country town called Taree. So I flew into Sydney, and then I would get a lift, still very young woman, and drive up to Taree. I think it's up, and stay with someone who I'd been billeted with to do these weekend workshops with a woman called Joanna, who was I think, working at a university in Sydney, but the training that she was offering was not available inside of a university at that time, even though in the UK it was very much a mainstream thing. Drama therapy was very much a new thing in Australia. And I really thought this was it for me. I thought combining my love of theatre and drama with my love of transpersonal counselling and bringing these forces together. And I went quite far into that training, really thinking that I would that would become what I did with my life. But that also turned out not to be it. But I'm very grateful for that work as well. I began to understand more of the tools that we can use, the importance of story and storying, and how we can reinscribe the narratives of our life simply by retelling them from a different perspective. I think what I was left wanting with drama therapy was that very often it was just reenacting trauma. So it was telling the same stories over again from that perspective of the suffering. And as you know, one of the greatest influences on my work, who I've never studied with personally, is Caroline Myss, and her question, what will you do with your pain? Very often in that kind of psychological model, I didn't feel like we were asking the question, what will we do with our pain? But we were simply getting more and more intimate with our pain. And to some extent, we need that level of self-awareness, but it left me wanting more. And so I left that behind, and still as a very young woman, I was working as an actor's agent, and I was a playwright. I decided that I didn't love, being an actor because we got bossed around and told what to do, but I loved writing. And so I was won a lot of awards in my 20s actually as a playwright in Western Australia, and actually national awards as well. And even after I moved to Melbourne, which was in 2002, I continued to win awards and ended up doing a PhD. So I ended up going into doing a PhD in the School of Creative Arts at Melbourne University after moving to Melbourne in 2002. Because this love of theatre and this love of learning wasn't leaving me, but also this love of going deep into the ways that humans make meaning out of their lives. And so as a playwright, a storyteller, I would look at the ways that we define ourselves by the stories and how we can re-inscribe these stories. And so some of my plays had titles like The Royal Astronomical Society for Wayward Girls, The Joy Before Thinking, The Not Yet Beautiful Girl, which is a direct reference from Clarissa Pinkola Estes's Women Who Run with Wolves, and A Slow and Steady Darkening Towards Light. So all of my plays were very, very much archetypal stories. I would take my own personal stories and I'd turn them into these myths and share them through the medium of theatre. And I had lots of plays produced in Melbourne, and did my PhD and produced, as it was a thesis and creative content or exegesis, and I produced a number of plays as part of that as well. But even in that PhD from one of Australia's best universities, what I wanted was the legitimacy of academia. I wanted to be part of that institution. I loved that campus. I loved walking around that beautiful campus in Carlton, knowing that I was part of that, Ivory Tower Institute, but knowing that I could never bring my spirituality into that space because there was really no paradigm. I could study religion or philosophy, Eastern philosophy, but that's not what I wanted. So I ended up doing my PhD in something called magical realism. And magical realism is a form of literature, but it looks at the intersection of the mundane and the extraordinary, or the magical and the mundane, or the spiritual and the ordinary world. And I, of course, had found my perfect match because that's what I'd been doing my whole life. I was walking these two paths. And my supervisor at Melbourne University was an incredible woman, is an incredible woman named Angela, and she was the head of the school. And she really is like my fairy godmother. So I arrived in Melbourne and saw an ad in the paper, sitting down outside my favorite new cafe in my new neighborhood of Carlton. And I looked at this ad, which was for a place in a postgraduate program at Melbourne University. And it was, in creative arts, which was like a block from my house. And I walked up to the building and I said, I want to book an interview for this. And the woman that was, you know, her secretary said, oh, based on what you've done, this is not the course that you want. If you want to go on to do a PhD, this is not the course for you, but let's make time for you to speak to Angela. Angela was the head of the school. She had no time, but somehow magically she appeared, and she and I sat down, and I think it was love at first sight for both of us. I'm not sure if she'd say that, but I certainly just fell in love with her. This tiny little poppet of a woman, Catholic woman, really, really, you know, fierce, robust, you know, just this incredible woman who made things happen. And she basically just took me under her wing, and she said, okay, what you need to do is this, this, and this is how we'll get you into a PhD. And that's exactly what I did. I had to do a postgraduate diploma, which I did, which was 1 year. And then I went into the PhD. And all of that is because of her championing me, because a lot of people at that university, interestingly, really didn't want me to get a PhD place, and they didn't want me to get a scholarship, which is what ultimately happened. I got a full scholarship to do that PhD, and she advocated for me the entire way for that to happen. And she's the one who connected me to the incredible playwrights that I would end up writing about as part of my PhD. And so I really do consider myself a magical realist, and that's what I would define a priestess as, is that we are the bridge between the mundane and the magical, or the miraculous, that we are, you know, once again, you know, bringing the divine into the ordinary waking reality and igniting the divinity within the ordinary. And my PhD was entitled Seeing in Unordinary Ways. And this theme of storying or narrative continued all the way through that PhD, where I was looking at how do we see the ordinary in extraordinary ways? How do we change our perception of reality? And that is my work. If you're going to boil it down to anything, is I teach women to change their perception of themselves. I teach women to change their minds about themselves. And we do that by changing the stories, changing the paradigm of the stories that we tell about ourselves and that we have been told about ourselves by the world. So this woman, you know, Angela, my PhD supervisor, deeply spiritual, but from a Catholic paradigm, although I have it on good record that she dabbled in the tarot, was this incredible fairy godmother who just connected me to that incredible opportunity, but also to the work that would go on to inform so much of what I do. One day I intend to turn my PhD thesis, not the boring dry bits, but the idea of magical realism, into a spiritual text, because as a philosophy for living, it's a very, very profound way of seeing the world. We talk about this idea of defamiliarizing, or looking at things from a fresh perspective, and that's exactly what I teach my women to do. And it's such an exciting thing to know that everything that I've done has led me to this point. So I'm going to leave it here for today. I will continue to share the journey of who my teachers are, who my influences are. I will never stop telling you about my teachers. I mean, I'm sure my students get bored that I cite all my references. Whenever I quote someone, I tell you who I'm quoting. I tell you where I found it. It's so important to me that I honor my teaching lineage and that I show you who has influenced me and made me what I am, because I don't emerge out of vacuum, out of the nothingness. I have had many incredible influences on me that have shaped me. And very often I find in this world of Facebook and social media is we erase our teachers, or we erase our influences, or we'll quote things that are not ours to quote. We'll de-identify our sources. And I'm not sure why. It's like we're all pursuing this magical unicorn of inventing something that no one else has ever done. But everything that I offer you is a compilation. It is the collection of my lived experience, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is made up by all of those influences, and I want to honor my teachers and keep letting you know who has influenced and shaped my work, and why I have reached this point, because it's now a journey. Let's say, I did my first spiritual training when I was 14, which was Reiki, and I'm now nearly 42. So we're coming up to a 30-year anniversary of me being actively on my path as a spiritual seeker. And, I want you to know who's influenced and shaped me, because that helps you make a choice about whether I'm the right teacher for you. So please honor your teachers. Don't erase them. It gives me more faith in you if I know that you have sat with people and let them mold you and shape you and influence you. Even if you turn around, and I've done this with some of my teachers, realize that they were not the ones for me anymore and needed to leave them behind, I still honor them for what they gave me. So thank you for joining me live. It's been such a joy to sit and share this story. Storytelling is absolutely at the heart of who I am. I would say that I am a storyteller, and that my medicine is to re-story or to reinscribe narrative. And it's such a pleasure to be able to kind of reflect, not just for you, but for myself also. And I will be doing more of this over this week, because I really want you to have a really good sense of who I am. Mwah. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to hang out with you all, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.